Today we're going to have a relatively quick view of the Abbasid Empire. So last class we looked at the Umayyad. Here we have a map of the Umayyad that we discussed last class. So we have in Saudi Arabia, current Saudi Arabia, Mecca and Medina. And then as you see further north, we have Damascus. So the centers of Umayyad power were in Jerusalem and Damascus, taking it away from the Arabian Peninsula. Yet these were the holy sites that were very much associated with early Islam: Mecca, Medina, Damascus, and Jerusalem. As you see, the point of Dar al-Islam, that very quickly, 30, 40, 50 years after the Prophet's death, Islam had greatly expanded from in the west, most of Spain that was conquered in 711, again during the middle of the Umayyad period, all the way Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. We see here the site of Kairouan, which we'll look at in the Abbasid period, across all of North Africa into Egypt, and then the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, current Saudi Arabia, as well as Syria, areas of Iraq and Iran, all the way to Isfahan and further eastward. So the Umayyad, as well as the Islamic Caliphate, grew very, very quickly. So we generally say the Umayyad is from 650 to 750, and today we're going to look at the Abbasid Caliphate that began approximately in 750. Its capital was Baghdad, and the population was approximately 1 million people, centered from the Baghdad capital. So this represents a shift from what we saw last time, a Mediterranean-focused culture, to a more Middle Eastern-focused culture. With Damascus, we saw influence coming from Greece. We saw influence generally from the Mediterranean, an awareness of Byzantine art, awareness of the Roman Empire. So there was a Western perspective. So here, as we move to Baghdad, is more of a Middle Eastern perspective, going back a little bit to what things we have seen before, but focus more on Iraq and Iran for its visual imagery. Very little survives of the early Baghdad. Here we have a representation of one of the gateways that originally led into the city and the larger metropolitan area. Baghdad was founded in 762. Here we have the Baghdad Gate. It is created, was built out of brick. So several things that we'll see today are from sun-dried brick. Now, in terms of the symbolism, before we go any further, we have to talk about the concept, the design concept, and the design foundation, the aesthetics of the Abbasid Empire. And there is one issue that is recurring and will be extremely evident in Abbasid art and many of the Islamic arts to continue, and that is the sense of the circle. So here we have our description. Baghdad originally was a round city with a diameter of about 2,300 meters. More important than the metric dimension is the notion expressed that the diameter corresponded to a single unit of measure that they call the mil. What is important here is the circle, diameter, the sense of measurement from a center point. The city was surrounded by a heavy high wall, provided with large towers and preceded by a deep ditch. In this sense, it appeared as a sort of a fortress. So that also coincides with what we saw of the Prophet's house in Medina, that sense of very thick walls. We also saw it in Mashhad, the thick walls and the sacred interior space or the private interior space as defined by a courtyard. So very thick walls, a strong sense of what's outside versus what is inside. There was also a deep ditch, meaning like a moat that went around the city, so it appeared like a fortress. There were four gates built on the same pattern, long vaulted halls, open areas, windows for light, uh, and so on and so forth. So there are four gates, each named by various directions of the compass and cities in those particular directions. But again, no trace is left of any of this. But there were two other elements. Upon each of those four cardinal points, those four gateways, there was a horseman, a statue. So there were human figures guarding over the various entry points into the city and a green dome. So last time we discussed the Kaaba, God's throne on earth, where you have the four emerald columns and then you have the ruby roof. So here we have a green dome. So the sense of a dome, the sense of a crowning element, of some very precious material, the sense that the crowning element is round, is domical, no matter whether it is a precious stone or whether it is it simply is glazed brick, like ceramic coating over brick. So those are very important congruences that we see within the Islamic narratives and architectural principles. So very early, the notion of a green dome had become a symbol of authority. So the dome is authority, whether it is spiritual authority or political authority. And then there are smaller domes over the gate, also with symbolic meaning, but giving a sense of hierarchy. So you have like the throne of God on earth has the large dome that is represented by the Kaaba. We have the garden pavilions in heaven that are represented by columns supporting domes and superstructures. And here in Baghdad, we also have the concept of the dome as a symbol of supreme authority. Okay, so in this example, in this brick example, we can easily see the various decorations floor by floor, giving a sense of a multi-storied structure. Each of those elements is like a reminiscence of a window or a doorway or a gateway. So like as we saw in Buddhism and also in Hinduism, it is a simulation of a multi-storied structure, but in these cases seen simply as a decorative element, where various floors of the building are simply seen as two-dimensional relief design on the surface of a larger structure. And here we also have another Abbasid example of brickwork. Again, this is all brick, and if you understand brick, bricks can be textured differently. They are set into place to create can be a very smooth wall texture, or if the bricks have a lot of relief on them individually, if they're very rough in their surfaces, they can give, like here, almost like a basket weave type of surface quality. So bricks can be strong individually, or they can blend into one another. So what we generally see in Abbasid and later in Seljuk periods, each brick has its own visual identity that gives almost like a weaving element, or it gives more dimension to the surfaces of the various walls. We also see that pointed arch in this example that gives a sense of three-dimensional depth for more light and shadow play. So even as you see in this slide, some areas, the front surfaces are very brightly illuminated and look very light in color, very high value, very bright white. And though the brickwork that is more recessed into the depths of the surface of the building are much lower value, darker, more shadowed. And a building that would have just a plain surface now becomes a surface that is more visually dynamic, more visually interesting. So the bricks on the surface give a sense of a textile weaving, but as we look at the bricks recessed within those arches, we get a sense of more floral patterns, dynamism. So bricks are very easy because they're molded. And any object, any surface, any material that is molded, it can be molded into rectangles or squares or cones or cylinders or spheres. So that gives the architect a larger visual vocabulary to create more diversity of pattern on the surfaces of these buildings. So let's go over some of the vocabulary that was briefly mentioned during the Umayyad lecture. So what are the parts of a mosque? What are the important elements of a mosque? So mosque simply translates as masjid, a place where one prostrates oneself in front of God. So a masjid can be in your house, it could be in your garden, it could be in your office. It is a place where you pray. It's as simple as that. In Islam, you pray 5 times a day, from strategically sunrise, sunset, and so forth. It could be done in your home. It could be done, as I said, outdoors. It can be done in a communal space. So a mosque literally is any place that you pray. It doesn't have to be that building where hundreds or thousands of people congregate on a Friday or during any other special occasion. It can be a private act or it can be a collective act. The imam is the one who leads the prayers. So he is a leader of collective worship. That term obviously is still used today. The minaret is the tower, and that is the place where the imam goes above the noise of the city to call the faithful to prayer. So when the imam goes to the top of the minaret in order to shout out the call to prayer to everyone in the neighborhood or everyone in the city, it doesn't mean that people have to then rush to a building. They can do it in their home. So it's just like an alarm clock, a reminder that is now time to prayer. Quite often the imam would actually broadcast the prayers from the minaret so people can follow regardless of where they are within the city. Or it can just be a call to prayer, just announcing the various times of the day. The minbar, qibla wall, and mihrab are essential parts of the building itself. Last time when we looked at the mosque in Damascus, we saw the courtyard. We saw that there is a place in order to wash oneself, to wash your hands, to wash your feet, a sense of cleansing as well as a sense of humility before God. Within the building, we saw it is simply just an open space for everyone to gather. There are no subdivided rooms. But these are the 3 things you need. A minbar is the pulpit. So you may have the call to prayers in the minaret, but then you actually have a pulpit. Similar to Christian prayer, you have a pulpit. So that is the imam walks up the steps. It is higher in the building, and from that higher elevation, he is able to address the whole congregation. So the minbar is the pulpit. The qibla wall I mentioned is the wall that you face. So the Qibla wall is identified, and that is the direction where you focus your prayers, because that will help align you in the direction of Mecca. The mihrab is an arch within the Qibla wall. So the Qibla wall is just the wall, one of the four walls of the main space. And on that Qibla wall is an arch that can be carved into the wall, it can be designed into the wall, but again, that further emphasizes that that is the direction towards Mecca. And as mentioned last time, the mihrab arch has a vertical visual component to it, so it not only directs your attention towards Mecca, it also directs your attention vertically up towards heavenly ascent. The largest mosque during the Abbasid period, it was at Samarra. Samarra was built at 847, and it became the capital after Baghdad. So we mentioned that Baghdad was the original capital of the Abbasids. It was founded in 762, but in 836, because of geopolitical situations, the capital was moved to Samarra, further up the Tigris River from Baghdad. So here we have the mosque. Obviously, very little of it survives, but even in its current ground plan, it was the largest in the world and probably would still be the largest in the world. Of course, my dimensions are in feet rather than in meters, but roughly the plan is about 250 meters by 150 meters. So it is a rectangle. It is the fortified wall. You actually have what looks like fortification towers attached to the external wall. The interior, just as we saw before, is dominated by a very large courtyard, open air courtyard. But if you look very closely at the slide, you see these horizontal lines, parallel lines on the left and on the right, and vertical lines at the bottom. So those lines represent the areas that were originally have been covered. As we mentioned before, you have columns and roof lines. So they would have been on the right and the left, and what we see in this slide at the bottom would have been the actual covered interior space where people would have congregated. As we see in this example, the minaret is outside of that rectangle. It's at the very top of this black and white photograph. And you see it is in a spiral form, a very important point that we're going to discuss in a few moments. So here we see it in a color photograph, a little more contemporary. So we see the thick walls. You can actually look inside in order to observe the ground plan and where the various columns would have been located. Obviously, the columns themselves and the roof lines for the porches for the structure no longer survives, but you get a good sense of the vast open courtyard, and then around the periphery of the interior space, you have the actual shaded areas and enclosed space. And then the minaret is separate outside. So here we see a detail of the exterior wall of Samarra, and it's the same thing. It's the brickwork again, where the bricks are very creatively organized in order to give a good light and shadow contrast, surface and depth contrast. So again, they are maximizing the fact of being in a hot climate with bright sunshine, that even if they design these bricks with very little distinction in their elevation, in the relief quality, when it is hit by the bright sunshine, there will be a very sharp visual contrast between light and dark, between surface and depth. So that is going to become a very important aspect of Islamic architecture. And it developed out of the brickwork, but also became translated into stone. That sense of visual contrast between light and dark, surface and depth, that is, in their minds, design. That is the quality of visual energy, visual tension, visual excitement that they will use universally in respect to design of the structures. So here we have some more detailed reliefs from Samarra, and you can see that because bricks are clay, and when they are wet, it is extremely easy to carve designs into them that will become permanent once the clay becomes sun-dried and firm. So there's very little relief contrast, but visually we get a very strong sense of positive, negative design. The surface is the positive, the recesses, the cuts, the slices into the surface become the negatives to give a very strong positive, negative, surface depth type of contrast. So these obviously have more organic shapes, more rounded shapes based on maybe plants and flowers. But it simply is designed for the sake of design, pattern for the sake of pattern, in order to break up the visual monotony of building surfaces. It creates a very animated surface that is extremely visually important. So here we get to the minaret. The minaret is about 55 meters tall. Some people say, because this is Iraq, that it looks like a ziggurat. It looks like some ancient, like 2000 BC type of Tower of Babel that we hear about in the Bible. But again, the purpose of it is for the imam to ascend. So a minaret needs to be very, very tall, so that the imam can broadcast the call to prayer and prayers themselves from the summit. So it is a staircase. It is functional. It is a staircase leading up to the summit where the prayers are broadcast. This is again made out of brick. Iraq does not have many good stone resources, so most of what was built in Babylon and afterwards, it was brick. So the most important aspect of this structure, and it's world famous, is the spiral. That it's not just a squared structure with an internal staircase. You walk up it in an upwardly spiral fashion. So there are many new things we're talking about today in terms of brickwork, in terms of animating surfaces with positive, negative, high relief, low relief, light versus shade contrast. The third major design element we mentioned with Baghdad. Baghdad was a circle. We have the concept of the dome, is the spiral. So there are 3 different spirals, but we're only going to look at 2 here. The third one is a little harder to visually identify. So here we have the empirical spiral. The empirical spiral, you see, is very tight. Whether it is the inner curl, the secondary curl, the third curl, the fourth curl, each one is the same width. Okay, you get that? So look at the center point. It curls in upon itself. So you have the center point. From that point to go straight down, So that point to the first spiral is the same distance as the first line to the second line to the third line to the fourth line, the last line, the outer boundary of that spiral. It unfolds with an equal velocity, with an equal pace. It is very measured. It unravels at the same pace over and over again. Each unfolding is the same diameter, is the same width. So it's slow, it is measured, it is consistent. Each line is the same distance from the next line, from the next line, from the next line. That's an empirical spiral. In contrast, we have the hyperbolic spiral. And in this spiral, each time it unfurls, as it continues, as the momentum picks up, the distances become greater and greater. So it's tighter in the middle, in the center, and as it starts to move, it just grows wider and wider and wider. It picks up a lot of speed. So empirical, as I said, you have a sense of a measured pace. It keeps moving at the same pace. Hyperbolic is more explosive. It starts small and it keeps picking up momentum. Each time it makes another circle, that circle is twice as wide, then another twice as wide, until it just spins off of the page. So that's hyperbolic. The third type of spiral is called tangential, and that is just completely explosive. You have your center point, and then it just radiates outward. It just goes outward like a pinwheel. But empirical spiral, hyperbolic spiral. So when you look at Islamic art, look for circles, okay? Look for surface depth and visual variety, and also look at spirals. Do you see a spiral within the composition? So here we have two women dancing. Okay, while they're dancing, they're pouring wine into these bowls. But look at their stomachs. The representation of creases and tension lines and folds within the garments over their stomachs are spirals. Look at the design of the fabric over their kneecaps. They're spirals. So within the clothing, we can see this emphasis on center points and this movement radiating outward from those center points. So their belly buttons are center points. Let's look at the woman in blue on the right. So you see the point for the belly button, and then you see it spirals outward, and then it comes out again. That looks like an empirical spiral. The distance from the first inner circle to the second circle, to the third circle, to the fourth circle are all equally spaced. When we look at the woman in orange, look at her belly button, you see the center point, and then I see a very tight circle around the belly button. Then I have another circle, and then another circle. They're concentric circles, all focused around that original center point. But they're all equal in distance. They're all equally measured. A sense of rationality, a sense of proportionality, a sense of measurement, a sense of mathematical coherence. But when we look at the knees, I see where the center point is supposed to be, but it's much looser. It's a much looser spiral. So it unfurls, it spins out of control much quicker. It's not as contained, it's not as structured, it's more explosive. I have a center point, and all of a sudden it spins very broadly, very widely, all the way across their thighs or across their calves. So within their clothes, we can see this tendency toward center points and spirals. But let's also look more at the composition. The center point of the actual composition as a whole is between their two hands and between the two bowls. There is a diamond-shaped empty white space. That actually is the center of the composition. So the hands, the two bowls create a circle, okay, around that diamond-shaped white space. Then let's broaden that circle out more. I have a face on the right, her neck, her chest, the scarf across her arms, into her right arm, into the other woman's chest and arm, the orange woman's neck, face, the spout of her wine jar, and the other over to the other spout of wine jar. So from face to face, chest to chest, arm to arm, I have another circle there. So I have a circle of hand, hand, bowl, bowl. Now take it out larger. I got face, face, chest, chest, arm, arm, scarf, scarf. That's a larger circle. Then I take it larger. And if I look at the wine jars, so if I go to the right, I have the wine jar of the woman in blue, her arm on the outside, her elbow, the scarf going across her chest, the scarf of the woman in orange, her far arm, and her entire jar. Now I got a larger circle oval. So I have the hands with the bowls, the faces with the chest, and then the arms with the whole jars. I have like a circular nexus within a circular nexus within a circular nexus. If we look even larger throughout the composition, again, the bowls and the hands are the center point. If I start in the center right with the wine jar, her hand to her elbow, the elbow leads down into the scarf that points down to her dancing raised leg. Her foot, I'm again on the right of the composition, the curve of her skirt to her right foot, over to the orange woman's left foot, across her skirt to the orange woman's right foot, up to her scarf, her elbow, her wrist, her hands, the wine jug. So really, if I look at the whole composition, the arms on the edges, the scarves on the edges, the feet on the edges, the skirts on the edges, I've got another big circular motion. So that's what we're talking about with Abbasid spirals. There's a sense of geometric repetition. This is all thought out very carefully, all very controlled. Because in a society of visual culture that is not so interested in the biological representation of the facts of the universe and observing science, you're looking for other organizing principles in order to create your composition. And a spiral, geometry, mathematics is going to be a very useful organizing principle. So here we have another image. Obviously, the prince is the center point of the composition. Specifically, his hand holding the cup is the center point of the composition. So let's just look at that. if his hand holding the goblet, the cup, is the center point, then his arm, his right arm on our left, his right arm into his shoulder, across his shoulder, into his left shoulder, his left arm that is angled then inward, it gives us a sense of circle there. Larger, we have a circle from his left shoulder to his head, to his right shoulder, to his arm, to his left kneecap, into his right kneecap. His whole body becomes like a circle. And then we got all these people circulating around him, from the two angels at the top to three men on the bottom left, three men on the bottom right, who look like musicians and other court attendants. So again, he's the center of that composition, and they are all seen as being within his circle. So not only is that compositional, it's also political, it's also social. It gives a sense of a hierarchy of importance, that whatever is at the center of the composition is narratively, symbolically, politically more important than what's at the periphery. And all of them emphasize what we have in the top left, top right, bottom left. All these things are like orbiting around him. We've seen that in Buddhism with the concepts of the mandala. You have the center point, the protagonist, and then you have these accessory figures that orbit around that center point. Like a mandala, it is a representation of a hierarchy, of a symbolic societal structure. But whereas the mandala is more transcending earthly reality in the heavenly zone, this is all very mindful of earthly hierarchies and political structures. So I also want to show you one of these brick reliefs. Now that we've looked at spirals, there are spirals and circles inside of circles here. So in the very center point, we have that leaf form that is surrounded by other leaves. Then you have the vine. Then you have the 8 other flowers, leaves around it. So you have a focal point. You have a circle around it. You have 8 elements floating around it, each one in their own circular vines, and then contained within other frames. A frame within a frame within a frame of various geometric elements radiating outward. In this case, there's no symbolism. It's just that they like that aesthetic concept. They consider that to be a sense of beauty, that centered sense of structure. Obviously, when we look at Islamic art, ceramic production is extremely important. These are obviously domestic objects, plates that would be used at the home, or else plates that would be used in the mosque itself for various rituals. So as smaller scale objects, they are able to disseminate various design concepts more completely throughout a whole culture, as I said, from spiritual environments to people's houses. The plates they use, or the plates they use only on special occasions for various holidays. In this case, you have your center point. Many plates have a circular depression in the middle where most of the food is placed. And then you have a rim around it. So it's actually, most plates are a circle within a circle. You have the recess in the middle and it's slightly raised on the edges. So all the food flows into the middle, or all the liquids flow into the middle. Obviously here we have Arabic script that would reference various aspects of the Quran or the Hadith, prayers or good wishes or goodwill. Quite often in Western plates, it is a floral border or a geometric pattern. It's very common in Islamic societies where you have script uh, letters, words, prayers within the rim of the plate. But even as you see here, the script has become so calligraphic, so abstract, so artsy, that it is a repetition of line for the sake of pattern. This is a very famous plate. It's gorgeous. It's very beautiful. So you have the black on the relative off-white surface, but that sense of the circular movement, as we mentioned, that sense of so this would be an empirical spiral from the center point to the edge of the inner recess. Okay, look at that distance. And then from the edge of the inner recess to the actual edge of the plate, it's more or less equidistant. It's more or less the same distance. From center to edge of the interior, edge of interior to the far edge of the plate itself. Even the script that becomes these beautiful vertical lines have a sense of mathematical spacing. Here, there is script there, but it is becoming, how shall we say, it's melting into a more abstract design. So in this case, we actually have almost like carved into the surface of the clay plate while it was still wet. You have incised lines. So lines that are subtly drawn into the plate, into the clay, to give it a little variation. So those are the leaf forms that you see. It is the designation of the center circle. Then you have the six like leaf forms coming out of it. Then you have additional leaf forms beyond that that have a little more definition. So that would have been literally drawn into the surface of the wet clay. Then, after the first firing, then you would do your glazes over the surface. But they like this look where the glazes are put on in a very loose liquid form. So during the firing process, it really starts, it's more fluid, it's more liquid, and it starts to run unpredictably over the surface of the actual plate. So some places the dark brown glaze is very contained. In some places it just flowed everywhere, and to some point where it actually became so diffuse that it almost disappears in the watery aspect of that glaze. But in this whole action, all of those brown glazes are all gravitating towards that center point. You still have a very strong center point there. And it's almost as if that inner circle, and from it is radiating these lines of dark brown glaze and green and yellow, as it, like in centrifugal force, is exploding outward. So while from the center point you have a circle, from that circle you have these six curves, leaf-like forms, and then you have more leaf-like forms that go to the edge of the vessel. There is a sense of measured repetition as we go from the center to out. That's a little more empirical, though not perfect. But then if you just look at the glazes, it's like an explosion coming out of the center point. It just goes out in like vertical rays, vertical trajectories. So that would be more of an explosive spiral. So it's like two different speeds within the same composition, a more measured speed for the actual floral design, but the glazes represent a more explosive outward energy from that center point to the periphery. So I'm just showing you another example of one of these fortresses. It's about a It's about 60, 70 kilometers outside of Baghdad, south of Baghdad. It's called Uqaydir. Again, brickwork. But brickwork is an opportunity for a little more experimentation than stone. It's cheaper, it's easier to use, it's easier to manipulate, not just in the design process, but the firing process and then the assembling process, the stacking process. So here, even in a fortress, you have that large courtyard, that large open interior space. You still even have here various like columns against the walls. These are not really functional, but it's a part of the tradition that around the courtyard you see a row of columns. That just becomes a given. Obviously, that comes from the Greeks and the Romans. And then we have some semicircular arches in various, between those columns. That again comes from the Mediterranean. So there's a little more influence here. Here we have another view, and you see again these columns embedded with the walls. We call them engaged columns, because they're engaged with the wall. The semicircular arches as a sense of a pattern, a repetition. Repetition and pattern are obviously extremely important for Islamic art. Here we have the ground plan, so you again see the large courtyard with around the courtyard various shaded areas, and then on one side you have the large room. Okay. Now, this format that we see for a fortress is also very adaptable to the mosque. What's the difference? It's the same concept for the mosque. So here we have the example of a mosque in Kairouan, which is in Tunisia. So we look at it as symptomatic of a fortress. We also look at it as symptomatic of a mosque. So on the far right, again, the interior space. You see two circles in that right interior space. One represents the entryway. Again, the entryway into Baghdad was a dome. You expect to see a circle over an entryway. And then the circle you see to the right of that against the wall is obviously to emphasize the Qibla wall and the mihrab arch. On the left of this plan, you see this dark square, pretty much aligned with the entryway and the mihrab arch, is the minaret itself. So at some point, we don't know what the justification is, the minaret was embedded within the fortress walls, not a separate building on itself. So here we have the aerial view of what we just looked at. So we see the large courtyard, we see the minaret on the right that is embedded within the wall, and on the other side of the courtyard you have a dome over the entryway. We actually had it also in the Mosque of Damascus. And then further we have a dome at the far end of the building over the center of the Qibla wall, which is the mihrab arch. Those are the basic parts of a mosque. That's it. So here we see it more, if you want to call it horizontal view. There is the minaret on the left embedded within the wall, and I can see the entry to the mosque assembly hall itself. You know, they want to emphasize this is where the doorway is, so that's why we have that added dome over the central doorway. And then I can see in the distance on the right the additional dome over the mihrab arch. So we're in the courtyard. Obviously my back is to the minaret, and I'm looking towards the entry into the mosque assembly room. What is in a courtyard? You have your place to wash. Sometimes in a courtyard you may have a treasury or buildings that house holy relics. But otherwise, it's a large open interior space. Here we have the entryway. So we have a series of semicircles a larger one for the main doorway with the dome up above. This is stone, it is not brick, but you can see a sense of surface variety in the way the architect used that stone. If you use stone of different colors, some are a little darker, some are a little lighter, and you juxtapose, you mix it up, you're going to create more surface visual interest than if everything were the same color and very boring. So look at the surface of AUA, the main building. And when you look at all of those blocks of tufa, in the West we call it tufa, here you say tuf. Each of those blocks of stone that were used to cover the building, they're all different shades. Some are more orange, some are more red, some are more grayish. There's some that are very blue, like a bluish gray. So if you very wisely mix blocks of different light, dark, different values, or different shades, the building becomes more visually interesting. It just does. Here we have an image of the interior. They all look alike. It looks very similar to what we saw last time with the Mosque of Damascus. It's simply columns holding up the roof line to allow for maximum traffic flow and accommodating the maximum number of congregants, people coming to pray, members of the congregation. In almost all of these mosques, obviously, you have rugs on the floor. When a rug wears out in a mosque, you are not allowed to remove it. You just put a new rug on top of it. So therefore, when you go to some of these very old mosques, obviously you take off your shoes before you go into a mosque. That is a requirement. The floor is very soft, it's very cushiony because it's centuries of rugs. So it actually is very comfortable. So the sense of people coming in, taking their place next in row, kneeling down, standing up, kneeling down, praying, all of those various rituals. It's a very soft floor surface because of the stacking over time of various rugs. In this case, in Tunisia, you have all of these Greek and Roman columns, so they would be appropriated from older buildings. So that's why they look so different, because they were taken from other structures. So again, it is a symbol of the ancient Greek and ancient Roman now giving way to the new religion, which is Islam. So the Greek and Roman building parts are now supporting the Islamic religion, figuratively and symbolically. Obviously, over time, they have to change the lighting. So many of the light fixtures, the chandeliers that we see today, are not the original ones, or they're the original ones, but they've been retrofitted for electricity. But they are generally the newest things we see in these structures. The other mosque we're looking at is in Cairo. So here we have the Mosque of Ibn Tulun, and same as what we just saw at Kairouan in Tunisia. So it's still the fortress mentality. Look at this slide. As you see on the top edge, it almost looks like what we call in the West fretwork. When you think of a fortress, you think of military defense. And people with bows and arrows or with other weapons hiding behind the roof line, waiting to see the enemy approaching and then all of a sudden being able to shoot an arrow in these very narrow openings in the wall surface. So you're very protected because you have the screen of stone, the screened wall, but there's still some openings there that allow you to shoot the enemy. So here at the mosque, you still have that same type of element on the roof line. So it is semi-military, but also becoming much more decorative and aesthetic. So it's that fortress mentality now becoming more of a design element. So here we're in the courtyard. There we see the building that has the water source. It's not a natural, none of these are natural water source. It's plumbing. It's a faucet with a little sink. So it can be a large public faucet, several faucets with a large public sink, but it is all plumbing. So here we have the open courtyard. We have the areas of the, of shade to provide shelter from the hot sun. And on one side, we'll have the entry to the actual prayer hall. Here, it's more of an artistic little photograph. We're standing in one of those shaded areas, looking across the courtyard for the minaret. So it's very interesting that the first level of the minaret is squared, but when we get to the middle level of the minaret, it's a spiral. So we see the staircase on the outside going in a spiral configuration around a cylinder, and then the very top of it is a cylinder within a cylinder. So think if you were like a drone looking straight down at that minaret, you have that center circle with another circle, with another circle, with a staircase circle wrapped around it in a cube. So that's a circle within a circle within a circle with a spiral staircase within a cube. That's again, and in this case, I think it is it would be viewed as an empirical spiral. Here we have actually the entry into the prayer hall. So again, the central arch is larger. It's much larger arch. And then we have above it the dome. Same thing. There is a tremendous family resemblance between all of these mosques of any particular period. So an Abbasid mosque, it doesn't matter if it's in Tunisia or if it's in Cairo, there's going to be, as I said, this family resemblance. The only difference with this one in Cairo is that they get a little more creative with those little fortification designs along the skyline of the building. So here again, looking another view of the courtyard. I like in this slide, you can see better in terms of the center pavilion. Again, a dome. Everything has to have a dome because that is Abbasid, that is Baghdad. Look at the different colors of stone on that structure. It's almost as if you have a row of very pale, almost white stone with red stone, and then white stone and red stone. It's like red and white stripes. So all of this, again, gives a sense of visual energy with very little imagery. So art doesn't need narrative. Art doesn't need illustration. Art doesn't need a storyline. Art can be good design that through lines, shapes, and colors are able to attract and engage the viewer. So within Ibn Tulun, here we have that image of the mihrab arch. So as I mentioned before, the mihrab arch is simply a niche within the Qibla wall. The Qibla, a mosque is very, very simple. But all of a sudden, in that long, long, long wall that everyone faces as they pray, there is this little niche. Just one element of visual emphasis on that whole wall. But as you see here, I got my white stripe, my red stripe, a gray stripe, a white stripe, a red stripe. It may be gray or it may be blue. You got warm versus cool colors. I have the inner columns are darker, the outer columns are lighter, but even the outer columns are made of a marble that has a lot of natural pattern within it. So I have gold versus white, I have dark versus light, I have warm color versus cool color. It's actually quite simple in terms of composition, but the artist maximizes the visual impact with color and texture. And then on top of all of that, I have high relief and low relief. I have the white surface of the wall with a couple little circles, circle within circle within circle, on the top right and the top left. So there again, I got my circle motif, top right and left, in low relief. And then look how recessed the dome, the arches. So I have shadow. I have shadow underneath as we get to the golden arch. And then another deep depth with more shadow as I get into the farthest recess of this arch. So I have high relief, low relief, as well as all those other elements. I got my spirals in there. But really, it looks so simple, but there was a tremendous amount of aesthetic thought and composition put into it. So I just want to end today by looking at some more domestic objects. So here we have an image of a figure on a ceramic vase. So again, look at framing elements, look at a center point and the next ring of elements, and then the next ring of elements that come outward. Like we saw with the two dancing women, the figures are becoming much more simple, much more abstract, much more two-dimensional. Last class we talked about the sense of the third commandment. You shouldn't make a graven image. You should not compete with God in the creation of the universe. An artist has a habit of creating an alternative reality in his or her art, but that would in some way represent arrogance, that you are competing with God and you can make an alternative reality, a visual reality that is just as good or even better than God's. So moving in this direction of pure design and abstraction moves it into a safe realm, moves it in, but even though it's a safe realm in terms of disrespecting God's word, it still is visually very complex and engaging and difficult to do in an expert, professional, technical way. So here we have another plate. So it is a princely figure who is playing a musical instrument. So obviously the hand and the body of the instrument is your center point. Even the hand in the circle of the bottom of that instrument is a circle within a circle. Then take it larger, his body, look at his, if you take the instrument outwards, up his shoulder, up his arm into his shoulder, across to the other shoulder, knee to knee. So shoulder, shoulder, knee, foot, knee. That's a circle. Take it a little larger, you got the whole circle of the plate. So you got the hand strumming the instrument, circle one. The torso, not counting the neck and the head, is circle number two. And then the rest of the plate is circle number three. So the head floats with the other objects, with the other circular designs. And you see little spirals of the circular design that are floating in the negative space of the room. It's all these little empirical spirals themselves. So there's a sense of flow, a sense of correspondence. All of these shapes relate to each other, not just in terms of dimension, of scale, but in the terms of family resemblance. So there really is a tremendous amount of thought and sophistication. So the last, no, it's not the last, but here, this plate, it's a little more geometric, it's a little more patterned. Um, each unit itself is a spinning circular form, repeated over and over again within the center of the plate and then move to the rim of the plate. A beautiful sense of mathematical formalism. So here we have a manuscript page, and we saw script being used in that other plate a while back. So again, even the script, even the word of the Quran, even the word of God becomes a sense of geometric, is visualized in visual geometric perfection. So like we saw with the mihrab arch, this is very similar to mihrab arch. I've got dark versus light. I have warm versus cool color. Look at the red dots. I have the gold. I have the repetition of line. I have a sense of forward and backward. That obviously the dark letters recede more. They look like they recede more into the distance versus the white surface of the page, and the gold seems to be coming out towards. So he's still playing with high value, low value, warm and cool in order to create a beautiful sense of rhythm and movement across the page. Of course, in Arabic, it's right to left, the writing. So you have this sense of flow and movement. And I like that golden band in the middle of the composition, that it goes beyond the dark brown, black ink of the script. So we have a sense of the organic flow of the pattern of that golden zone, that golden horizontal row against the more formal but still very fluid movement of the calligraphic black, dark brown ink. Okay, so that is the Abbasid period. So where Umayyad was the transition, the beginning of the symbolism, it actually is the Abbasid that establishes the design elements, the formal elements, the visual vocabulary that will be used for centuries to come. Okay, thank you very much.